conflict is functional. Conflict is functional and often leads to change through a delegation. So just because you're a conflict theorist doesn't mean that you always believe in a violent sort of a struggle. You can struggle, but you can do it very civilly. And I think that's what Louis Koser, I don't think we really talk about him in this book, but if you study sociological theory, that's one of the things you would look at. Historical progression, now he called this the economic historical law of motion, a result of conflict and friction between the powerful and the powerless. Like I talked about before, you can call it whatever you want, but it's still class conflict, whether it's Roman, plebeian, civilized, uncivilized, master slave, pharaoh slave, doesn't matter. Now, usually, if like on a test, or if you're reading something from a conflict perspective in sociology, you're going to see words like exploitation, alienation, conflict, competition, and words like inequality. You can use these words can be attributed to any chapter on inequality that you basically study. It doesn't just have to be class conflict. Now, Marx is considered the father of conflict sociology or conflict theory or critical theory, but his theory is very useful at addressing any kind of inequality. Did Marx directly talk about any of these other types of inequality? Did he talk about race, gender, colonialism, or global inequality? The answer to that is no. Now, this might surprise some of you, and I may have addressed this before, but many of the classical theorists, like Marx, they were very, anti-race. They were racist. They were homophobic. They were chauvinistic. They were all the things that we try to argue against and give a voice to. So you might be asking yourself, well, that sounds very counterintuitive. So why is conflict theory still useful to these issues that Marx didn't directly talk about? Because we're still asking the central question: who has the power and control? Marx didn't directly deal with issues of race, but he did argue that anytime the bourgeoisie could keep the proletariat divided, it was going to be useful for those in power. So yes, there was a lot of racial strife and slavery and racism and bigotry and hate during the time of Marx, like there always had. He didn't directly write about racism, but he would say that yes, that would be one way that you can keep the working class divided amongst itself. So instead of going against those in power, where the real problem comes from, you just keep the working class fighting against itself, so they could never have a revolution. Okay, I'm trying to get you guys into the mind of Marx, and we're doing that really by applying the sociological imagination by looking at the context in which Marx wrote. Okay, and I'm not trying to excuse Marx's racist or chauvinistic. I'm not trying to excuse any of that, but that was very common of many early philosophers and social scientists, unfortunately. Okay, Marxism and class conflict. Marx believed that conflict was a normal feature of society. And a lot of this goes back to the idea of philosophy. If you study philosophy, you look at human nature. Okay, human nature is, you got to be naive to believe that human nature is not fraught with things like greed, graft, and corruption and jealousy. There are theories in behavioral science, and I'm not picking on psychology, but if you're a psychology major, you might get into what's called humanist psychology. Okay, and there are some branches of the social sciences, behavioral sciences, which invariably believes that people are fundamentally good. I don't agree with that necessarily. I'm more of a cynic when it comes to human nature, but I believe it's kind of naive. But there are people that do believe that people are fundamentally good. I don't know if any of you have ever been to the Anne Frank Memorial. How many of you have been to that museum, the Holocaust Museum, the Anne Frank? Has anybody visited that? Sid has. Anyone else? Okay, Ruby. I teach a UF 200 class. If you guys ever sign up to take me, my class is called A Survey of Inequality, but one of the assignments I do is I have students visit that museum. Well, the reason I bring this up is because Anne Frank had a very interesting quote, or it's a quote that's actually written on the stone as you're coming into campus. And I should know the quote by heart. I see it every time I drive into campus, but it's something to the effect that despite everything, people are good at heart. And I've always had trouble with that because I disagree with that. And it's really, I really have to give, my hat is really off to Anne Frank and those that went through the Holocaust that believe that, to really believe that people are fundamentally good at the face of death. But that's something that I don't really agree with. I think people are fundamentally bad. They can be disciplined. We talked about deviance. You can have a good moral foundation, but people are capable of doing anything, even with the best of intentions. So, okay, but that's kind of a different discussion. But conflict is a normal feature of society. I think most of you would agree with that. Individuals, groups use power to promote their interest. The more powerful you are, the more that you're going to be able to promote those interests. Okay, now think about that for a minute. If you're a corporation, or if you are a very, very wealthy individual, the more power you're going to have. I mean, that's just the way that it is. The more money you have, the more powerful you are. One of the things we looked at in the last chapter is we looked at deviance. We looked at the delineation between white and blue collar crime and criminals. It's really no surprise or not surprising that the more money you have, you're looked at as a white collar kind of individual, a white collar crime, the more likely you are to get a lesser sentence or not be prosecuted. The poorer you are, they're more likely to be prosecuted than not be prosecuted. And a lot of that goes back to wealth and power. It really does. If you look at deviance from a conflict lens, which we did last week, deviants are written by the powerful. They're the ones that decide what's deviant and what isn't. They're also the ones that write the laws, and they're the same laws that are used to punish punitively, the working class, if you want to look at it from a Marxian point of view. Whereas where the powerful or the bourgeoisie would write the laws and break the laws, so they don't always follow the laws. They would say, and pardon the cliche, but they would say, rules are for chumps or something like that. Okay, individuals and groups use power to promote their interests, especially the more influence they have or the more wealth they have. Power is exerted through force, rules, laws, and philosophies or ideologies. That's very true. If you have the power to begin with, and you can afford the law enforcement or the force, you can write the rules or influence the rules. The laws can go against others. Think about Bill Gates. I'm going to give you guys an example from the pandemic. Bill Gates is not a medical doctor. He's not a scientist. But look at all the influence he has in research and health and pharmaceuticals and everything else. He uses his power to promote his interests. Think about that for a minute. Okay? He's not a doctor, but he has too much power. Shouldn't the doctors decide what's best for their patients, or should it be some billionaire that sold Microsoft that makes those decisions and influences research and everything? But that's the way that things work, even on an institutional research level. Those in positions of power promote their interest, their money, their bribery. Okay. No, I'm not against vaccines. I'm not saying anything about that, but he widely influenced it. And think about all the money that he was able to reap from the vaccines. Okay. And there's more that can be discussed with that, but power is promoted through, people promote their interest through power. And it's like freedom of speech. If you look at the tech giants, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, if you say something that under the terms of agreement that they find offensive or that they disagree with, you're going to be shut down. You're going to be silenced. You're going to be shadow banned. Now, under our Constitution, we do have the right to freedom of speech. We do have the First Amendment. But it seems like people that are in positions of power can control what's popular and what's not popular. Okay, and it doesn't matter what side of the political aisle you're on. People they should at least have freedom of speech. But that's questionable now. But people use their power. Power is exerted through force, laws, rules, and ideologies. That's very true. That's one of the problems with power. That's one of the problems with wealth. With wealth comes great power. It's one thing to be wealthy, but to use that wealth to influence others, that really goes to where a lot of the problems are. Okay, if you really stop and think about it. Marxian ideas. Now, Marx, if you study philosophy, you get into what's called materialism, materialist philosophy, materialistic Marxism. He was a materialist. He believed that the driving force of change was in economics. Economics are things that are tangible and not necessarily ideas. He believed that change came from conflict due to class disagreements. Okay, conflict is oftentimes brought on by the exploitation of the poor by the rich under a capitalist system. Now, again, I'm not anti-capitalist, but I am anti-corporatist. Okay, and I will try to explain what that means today if I can get to it. Yeah, sorry, I think I typed that wrong. I spelled it kind of fast. Okay, so I am anti-corporatist, or you could also say I'm anti-crony capitalist, if you guys know what that is. Okay, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Now, here are the characteristics of each class that Marx delineated or that he talked about. You have the bourgeois. I'm sorry that this is sort of blurred here. I don't mean that. But you have the bourgeois. Now, the bourgeois hold the power. And if you recall, I think it was during chapter 2 on culture, we looked at what was called the dominant culture. The dominant culture creates the narratives. They have the power. From a Marxian point of view, you could therefore argue, you could reach the conclusion that if the bourgeoisie are the ones that hold power and the dominant culture are the powerful, then the bourgeoisie represents the dominant culture. In rhetoric, we call that a syllogism, or we call it deductive reasoning. That's the conclusion that we've reached. The dominant culture is made up of the bourgeoisie. Now, again, the bourgeois or the dominant culture does not often represent a numerical superiority. Oftentimes, it's numerical minority. Like here, the bourgeoisie represent 10% or less of society. But because they have power, because of their wealth, they determine what's right, what's wrong, what the norms and values are, what the laws are, what's deviant, what's not deviant. They basically create the narrative that influences mass media, that influences history, that influences drug manufacturing, that influences pharmaceuticals, that influences research and things like that, because they have the power. The proletariat, on the other hand, lack the power and they lack the voice. Why is critical theory so important to social and liberal arts and sciences? Because they try to give a voice to those that have oftentimes not had a voice. That's why there's a stereotype in the social sciences or the liberal arts that, you hear people say, oh, they're crazy communists or Marxists or they're left-wingers. That's not really true. But what is true is they are more prone to taking a critical look at things. Okay, it's kind of like business. They're going to look at the human toll of profit, not necessarily profit itself. That's not really the role of business or economics, but it is the role of social sciences. And I hope you guys can kind of appreciate that. And you should look at issues from multiple angles. But again, it doesn't mean that you have to look at profit as an evil thing. It's not necessarily an evil thing. Monopolization is. I mean, there are some things about it that can be. Exploitation can be. But it just depends. So it's always important to look at things critically. It doesn't matter what major you're in. If you're a nursing major or a healthcare major, look at access to healthcare. Some of you that are going into nursing, and I think some of you are healthcare patients, but healthcare majors. My wife is a nurse. She sees it all the time. If you have Medicaid or Medicare, if you have the best insurance or don't have any insurance, your treatment is going to be different. You're going to be treated differently. You shouldn't be, but oftentimes that's what happens. You might have a major surgery, and because your insurance isn't going to pay for a 2-night stay in the hospital, a post-op when you need that, guess what? You're going to be kicked out. They'll probably give you a few hours, but if your insurance doesn't pay it, well, you need to leave. Okay, that's the way it is. And you will see that. So conflict or critical theory is important regardless of what your major is. Marx referred to the bourgeois as the capitalist. He referred to the proletariat as the working class. The bourgeois is a French word that means of the town. They're the modern day socialites, whereas the proletariat would be the working class. It would be more colloquially, it would be the 99 percenters. It would be the blue collar individuals. It would be the mass. It would be the majority. The bourgeois, and we're going to talk about this in the next slide, the bourgeois own the means of production, whereas the proletariat work for the means of production. Now, while I'm still discussing this, I want you to look up what the means of production actually means. I'm going to discuss it in the next slide. The bourgeois promote labor as a commodity. Marx wrote in his writings, he called this the commodification of labor, and the proletariat are forced to sell their labor as a commodity. Marx called this the fetish of commodities. That fetish just means that you have a hang up on something. You have a fascination with something. Well, capitalists or the bourgeoisie would have a fetish of things that can be bought, sold, and traded, like labor. Now, one of the fundamental agreements that Marx had against the capitalist system was that human worth and human dignity. Okay, sorry. And you guys feel free to write down these notes I put in the chat, because if we were actually in the physical classroom, the chat would be my whiteboard. Okay, human worth or dignity is lost because labor is sold. Okay, so your human worth is reduced to a wage that makes profit for others. So you're basically stripped of human dignity. So one of the problems Marx had, I believe Marx called this homo faber. Homo faber just means man, the maker. So man is, I don't want to get on a philosophical rant, and I'm not a philosopher or anything, but if you read the philosophies, I've got to take a lot of philosophy classes, like many of you will have to. Man is inherently creative, and he creates with his hands, but when your worth is reduced to that of a profit margin based on the sweat of your brow or the labor itself, that creative essence, man the maker, homo faber, is basically lost. So you lose a connection with that which you produce, and you are reduced to a cog in the wheel, assembling something just for the exploitation of the wealthy that control the business that you work for. That's what basically happens. So you end up losing your individual dignity and worth because your worth is reduced to a wage. You know, how much do you make an hour? How much profit can you make this individual by what you produce? That's what you're reduced to. So you basically have, you lose human dignity, is basically what he argued. Okay, now here's Marx's model of class. Okay, now let me see, sorry. I want to go back to something. I thought I had a slide on this, but I didn't. What is the means of production? What does that mean? What is the means of production? You get, like I said, did anybody find it in the book? Does anybody have a sort of a definition, your own definition? What is the means of production? This is on your study guide and it's pertinent to this chapter. What does that mean? Okay, now Marx, why is this important? Because Marx defined class on the basis to one's relationship to the means of production. Now that should be on your study guide. Charlotte says, isn't it like capital, like the bill? Yes, now you got to think about means. Means is kind of the key word. Means would be the industry, it would be whatever is controlled, whatever is owned by which other people can produce. Sid said it is what is necessary for life. Well, yeah, in a sense. But if the means of production might be like you own the factory, you own the bank, you own the industry, okay, you own the schools by which you have teachers that work for you, or the universities. You're an owner. It means that you basically own the livelihood of other people. Now, today, a modern day example of this might be the big tech companies. The modern day bourgeoisie, or the robber barons of the 19th century during the time of Marx, would be big tech. Now, for those of you that are in business or marketing or economics, we would call these the FANG stocks, for example. If you know anything about Wall Street or anything, that would be Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google. That's what that stands for. But you also have Twitter. But those are called the FANG stocks. These would be companies that are owned by the multiple billionaires. These would be the big tech. The owners would be the robber barons of yesterday. They own the proverbial means of production because many people work for these big tech companies. And there's other examples of means of production too, but that's just a modern example. Okay, so Marx believed that your relationship to the means of production determined your class. You were either a worker, which meant you were proletariat, or you were an owner, which meant that you were bourgeois or you were a capitalist. According to Marx, there were just three classes. The capitalist, those who own the means of production. Now it's used as a synonym interchangeably with bourgeoisie. Then you have the worker, which is oftentimes used interchangeably with proletariat. Then you had what's lesser known, it's called the inconsequential others. The inconsequential others would be the beggars, it would be the people that are chronically unemployed, it would be people that are indigent, people that are homeless, the working poor, people that are on the street, people that are kind of on the margins of society. They're marginalized. Okay, those would be the third class. Marx believed that human history represented epochs of class conflict that evolved over time. That's very true. And under conflict theory, you not only ask who has the power and control, but there's also a struggle for scarce resources. Whatever that resource is, that that resource oftentimes is power and authority or political power. It's oftentimes wealth. It could be military. It could be force. It could be gold. It could be whatever the case is. It could be land. It could be raw resources. Those are scarce resources that are oftentimes, there's a struggle between the haves and the have-nots. Now, the elites use their power. They already have power based on their wealth to use as a means of control or an instrument over control over other groups. Now, I do want to talk about something really interesting. So we looked at Marx and we looked at his definition of class. Now we're going to look at Weber, his definition of class. Now, one of the, if you're in academia, if you make a career out of academia or science, they're really kind of one and the same. But if you stay in academia, either as a researcher, as a professor, as a teacher, you go into graduate school, there's an old saying, and that saying goes that we stand on the shoulders of giants. And what that basically means is we have big shoes to fill. But science and academia is not static. It means that we always want to push the boundaries forward to make new discoveries and have new insights into ideas and human nature and everything else. Well, Weber, in a sense, did the same thing. He was a contemporary of Marx, which basically means he lived during the time of Marx. After Marx died, he was still young. And basically what he did, he stood on the shoulder of giants, Marx being a giant, and he looked at class inequality and he looked at the definition of class, and Weber said, wait a minute. There's more than just wealth when it comes to how we decide on and define social class. Now, Weber called these property, power, and prestige. Karl Marx said that you're a bourgeois, you're bourgeoisie, you're a proletariat. Weber would call that wealth. So in other words, if you're an owner or a worker, that determines your wealth. So in other words, property alone was a determinant for your class. Weber said, yes, that's part of it, but it's only part. There are two other variables that also determine one's social class. You have power, which oftentimes comes, works alongside wealth, and then you have prestige. Now, power can mean like family name. Prestige can mean like title or occupation. These things have their own influence. It's one thing to have money, but it's another thing to have a family name. Usually you get power from the wealth you have. It's one thing for Bill Gates to be a multiple billionaire. It's one thing for Jeff Bezos and Jack Dorsey and all these different people to be multiple billionaires, Elon Musk and all these others, or Donald Trump. It's one thing for them to have a lot of wealth, but the problem is, according to Weber, with their wealth, they also have power. And power is also a semblance of class. Now, Weber called this, we'll get into status inconsistency here in a minute, but Weber initially believed this was called status consistency. Usually you use your wealth, you use your influence, and you use your pedigree as a semblance of class. And there isn't one that's more powerful than the other. If you look inside the book, these, I like to call them the 3P variables. These three 3P variables are kind of interchangeable. So Weber believed that usually when you ranked high in one, you ranked high in all three. Now, what we're starting to see today is not really status consistency. we're starting to see status inconsistency. This means that you might rank one and high in one, but you rank low in the other two or the other three. Can anybody think of an example of status inconsistency? What would be an example of status inconsistency? How can you rank high in one but low in the other ones? What would that look like? What would be some occupations? What do you guys think? I talked about this in my morning class. Can anybody think of an occupation that's very prestigious but doesn't pay very well? Okay, Charlotte said, well, yeah, I do agree with that, but I think just what they do, whether or not we look at them as prestigious, they are going to have prestige. Okay, that's a good example. Not quite what I'm looking for, but that's a good example. Good guess. You're on the right track. What would be an example of ranking high in one, but not the others? What's something that's very prestigious, but doesn't always pay well or doesn't always give you a lot of authority or power? Yeah, very good, Jordan. Yeah. Well, educators would be one. Yeah, social work, absolutely. This is where, yeah, counseling, very good, Jason. Yeah, this is where you get into what's called status inconsistency. What we are starting to see in this country is we're starting to see a rise of the, I'm going to put quotes around this, educated class. What that means is we have a lot of status inconsistency. I think, what is it? I just read this the other day. There was a statistic I read on this. 8% of the population have bachelor's degrees, 2% I think have doctorate degrees, 4% I believe have master's degrees. Well, whatever that is, most people would look at those groups as having a certain degree of prestige. Okay, but they experience status inconsistency because with their education, their level of wealth or influence doesn't always match the education or prestige that they actually have. Now, another example with property, with wealth itself, might be lottery winners. Okay, you might win the lottery, but you're called nouveau rich. Okay, and a lot of times people that win the lottery, and if you guys do follow-ups on their stories, there's actually a lot of tragedy to it. A lot of times they don't really know how to handle their personal finances. They lose money, they go bankrupt, they give their money away, they don't spend it correctly. And a lot of times, just because they have that wealth, they certainly don't have power or prestige. In fact, if you look at the class pyramid, you do have the pinnacle of the pyramid. You have what's called old versus new money, or nouveau wealth.
Can I add on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, the people that win the lottery and such like that, obviously they win an absurd amount of money. And like you said, they do things, and there's statistics that show that they most likely end up in prison or they end up dead because they think they have all this power. But the people like Bezos and Elon, all these guys, they earn the power on the way up to being wealthy, you know? Like they start out just like a normal guy, just doing like working in their little basement or something. Like they earn power on the way up. So I feel like it's just more respectable power that they have compared to just anybody else that has the same amount of money, you know? like somebody that inherited it and didn't earn it in a way.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, you actually make up a very interesting point regarding old money and new money, because I think it's going to be Friday, Noah. Right, Noah, I think you were the one that was commenting. But I think it's on Friday, we actually look at it's called the social class pyramid. And once you get to the pinnacle, you have old money at the top and you have new money at the bottom. Now, Bill Gates, Dorsey, Bezos, and I don't belittle anybody that has wealth or power. I don't. It's just how they accumulate it. That's the only thing I'm critical of. But wealth itself isn't something that I'm, against. But you're right. Those people would be considered new money, not old money. And therefore, they would still be frowned upon, even though many of those that are in the big tech companies or people like Elon Musk are some of the wealthiest people in the world. They have more money than even some of the old money. Now, why does that matter? It matters when you get to the very top of the pyramid, because at that point, it's not necessarily about property, but it's about prestige and power, more so than it is about wealth.
Yeah, like also, I don't know if you see like those big guys, Elon, all those guys, they post on social media and you just go scroll through the comments and you see that these people are begging and they'll do anything for money. And it's just because they have the power that they bring with the amount of money they have. People will do anything for it. They'll give their lives for it. And it's just because of the dollar, it's more of just how much money an individual has. And it's just hard to wrap your mind around, honestly.
It is, yeah. And that really, and that's a good point. It really begs a bigger question. How much wealth and how much power should one person actually have? Again, I don't think it's so much wealth, but how much influence should they be allowed to have? Maybe it's the bigger question. Bill Gates, I know that he's got all this money, but should he be the one dictating health policy? I don't think so. At some point, we should leave that to the professionals, but oftentimes it's not what happens because money speaks. Because again, it goes back to those attributes of human nature, greed, corruption. People are corrupt. They want handouts. They want money. And these people that have power oftentimes are given power because of their wealth. And they can pay off these people and they can have the influence that they have, which is one of the problems with politics today, if you want to know the truth. Regardless of if you're right or left, it doesn't really matter. I think most sensible people would agree that you have to get money out of politics. Doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on. But that's a good point. So yeah, you have to keep things in perspective. Jordan says, like when he talked about people going to school to be a doctor, but they aren't working as a doctor. That could be. Asher says status inconsistency sounds like a great cop-out for a poor way of categorizing class based on the way I'm hearing it. Not sure what you mean. Can you explain? What do you mean cop-out for a poor way of categorizing class? I just don't understand that. It's kind of like a new class. That's what that means. So it's like saying that, yes, you have people that are educated that kind of belong to a class of their own, because with an education comes prestige, but they're not really paid. They're not really paid what their education says that they're probably worth. Therefore, they're kind of put in a class of their own. Just labeling people. Yeah. Well, it's not my theory. But I know what you're saying. That's the theory. Okay, that's called status inconsistency. Yeah, and again, I'm just trying to give you guys examples. Yeah, Asher, I know that. But yeah, that is a good point. But it's kind of a funny point too, because you got to remember, as social scientists, as scientists in general, we always have a propensity to try to label and categorize and explain everything. And to your credit, that's a very good point. That's a very good observation. People, and that is one of the goals of science, to categorize, explain, and describe. And that is true. It's like we have this new group But what do we do with this group? Because they don't fit into status consistency, so they're status inconsistent because they rank low. Now, we talked about where you might rank low in terms of prestige or property, but can anybody think of where you might rank low in terms of power? But you do make pretty good money, or you do have some degree of prestige. Somebody brought up a really good example in my last class, and I can't remember what it was, but I wanted to use it. Can anybody just off the cuff think about where they may not have power, but they do have wealth? Or they might have prestige? I'm trying to think of what that example was. I really enjoy learning from my students. Yeah, okay. Alexis, very good point. It might be like a celebrity, maybe it's somebody, sometimes you hear about celebrities that go broke, they go bankrupt. I really feel sorry for, and I know you guys are going to say, why do you feel sorry for them? Because they're rich and they live in a world of their own. Because celebrities live in a very superficial world. All they have is perception. All they have are looks. Once those looks are gone, their perception is not in their favor. It's a very superficial culture. It's a very superficial reality. That's why it's not uncommon for these celebrities, when they age, they're horrified. They have to keep undergoing plastic surgery. They're always trying to look relevant. They're always trying to stay young. And in a way, in kind of a perverse way, you kind of feel sorry for them. It's like, oh, brother, they're so superficial. That's all they have at the end of the day. Very superficial. But yeah, sometimes you hear stories about, famous musicians or celebrities or TV stars that end up on Skid Row. They end up going bankrupt. They lose everything. They go from millionaires to homeless. So they still have the prestige, but they don't have the power anymore. People would probably still want their autograph, but they don't really have wealth. They don't really have the power that they once had. Okay. They just have maybe their former name, or something like that. But yeah, so these would all be examples of being status inconsistent or status inconsistency. Very good discussion, everybody. And like I said, your comments, your interjections, whether you type it, whether you mute it, whether you unmute your mic, or however it is you get it through, you're always welcome to interject in the classroom. And I don't take anything personally. I don't. You guys make really good comments, and I do appreciate it. Okay, let's look at systems of economies or economic systems. We look at capitalism. We look at, let me see, there's capitalism, there's socialism, and of course you have communism. Now, one of the common questions I get is, well, what's the difference between socialism and communism, socialism and capitalism? Well, that's kind of a tricky question. I feel like I can answer it, but I feel like that answer is kind of vague and maybe not good enough. But from my understanding, socialism is when you do have collective ownership, not private. But one of the differences between socialism and communism is you still have classes, but you do experience what are called wage caps. So you don't have the disparity. Like under a capitalist system, you can kind of make as much as you want. Under a socialist system, yes, you're still going to have the upper, middle, and lower classes, but there's going to be caps. In other words, you can't just make so much more than somebody else. Like a doctor in the United Kingdom might cap out at 200,000 pounds or euros a year. Whereas in our country, a doctor can make as much as they can make per year. So in Europe, under a socialist system, like many countries in Europe many Western European countries are very socialistic. I wouldn't call them communist, They still have classes, but they do cap perhaps what they make. So there's a limit. They control it. And the word that we use in economics is disparity. Disparity just means gap. Here we just have gaps. It's just crazy. You make so much more than someone else. But if you cap it, you can kind of keep somewhat of a balance. Now, whether that's right or wrong, that's just one example. Communism is a little bit more extreme, but it really depends on the definition. It depends on the flavor. There's multiple flavors or gradations, if you will, of capitalism, socialism, and communism. Gradations just means grades. There's different definitions. The capitalism of today is not the same as it was 100 years ago, and it's probably not the same as it was 200 years ago. It always changes. We haven't really lived in a capitalist society for probably 100 years. We live in a corporatist kind of society, a crony, maybe not even that long, maybe 70 or 80 years, but maybe a crony capitalist society where it's about monopolization. You know, capitalism, the means of production and distribution are privately held. That means it's free of government. Theoretically, it's free of government intervention. Okay, it's the producers that determine, based on supply and demand, they determine price controls. They determine the consumer price index, how much something is worth. The profit motive, which no, I don't believe profit within itself is necessarily bad. And I do understand it from an economic and business point of view. Profit, you need a certain amount of profit to hire other people. It's those that have money that do create jobs. They put the money back into the business. In theory, they grow the business, they keep a little bit for themselves. That's profit. Okay? And that's the guiding principle of behavior. That's what creates businesses. I do understand that. But here's the thing. Under capitalism, you have competition. Here's where we run into the problem. Under corporatism and crony capitalism, you no longer have self-correcting markets or competition. You have monopolies. The only reason that we have price gouging is because we no longer have healthy competition. The way that free markets work, and if you study Adam Smith is kind of he's considered the father of free markets. Okay, but Adam Smith believed that markets under capitalism are self-correcting. So one of the ways that you keep price gouging at bay is you force other businesses to compete. If you want to sell your wares or your widgets or your products, then you have to keep your prices low and people will go to you. If other people are competing and they sell their prices high, people are probably not going to purchase their products. So they're going to buy yours. So it forces, through competition, in theory, it forces prices to be under control. That's healthy competition. And another thing, what it means by self-correcting, capitalism is, in theory, at least initially, the idea is self-correcting markets. If you have a business that's not run correctly, or if it doesn't meet the demands of potential consumers, that business is going to go out and another business is going to be allowed to take its place because it's more efficient. We don't see that today. You know, you have governments, politicians that give, too big to fail companies, big box stores money, while mom and pop businesses go dry and they die out. That's not a self-correcting market. That's not a free market. Okay, technically, that we don't live in a free market system because of that. Now, the idea of capitalism is technically, you could argue, it represents the freest system, or the most system where the likelihood of being free exists, where you can work your way up and you can have wealth and you throw from your hard work and education, but that is not necessarily the case anymore, as we'll discuss as we go a little bit further. So there's free competition in both among producer and consumer of goods. You compete. Competition is warranted. And we used to have laws, I think they were called antitrust laws. For those of you that are in business or study economics, you might want to look up antitrust. I think they're also called Glass-Steagall. I don't know if I have the Glass-Steagall Act. I don't know if I'm spelling that right. The last two names of two people. Glass-Steagall was overturned. There's just through politicians over the years, we've seen a dismantling of the capitalist system, a slow erosion, if you will. Well, anyways, everybody, I will finish up on Friday. I think it's been a really fun lecture. Hopefully you guys think it has been. I'll try to do maybe an activity in groups when I get through the lecture. I'll stay on for a few minutes afterwards if you have any questions, but if not, everybody have a good rest of the week. I'll see you Friday.
Thank you, Dr. Reed.
Yeah, thanks. Very good discussion today. I appreciate it.